After a few weeks of watching and reviewing movies of dubious quality, I finally found something good. Sangre is easily one of the best movies I've seen this year. It's not foolproof. In fact, it might bamboozle more people than it speaks to. But I'll tell you why I like it. And then, we could talk about this movie for hours and hours and hours. I'll try to keep it to a little bit less than that. First things first, if you've got this movie filed away under horror or giallo, you aren't really setting yourself up for success. There is a lot of blood in Sangre. The title means holy blood, Batman, and it was produced by Dario Argento's brother, Claudio. But this isn't an exploitation film, I promise. The words that come to my mind are folklore, surrealism, magical realism, perhaps, even though there's no real magic in it, but there is quite a bit of fake magic. And there is a feeling that we're drifting in and out of reality. Now, I say it's not an exploitation film. This isn't to say that Jodorowsky doesn't needle the audience a little bit, or that the movie is totally serious throughout. But if you're watching it to relish in the gore, which there actually isn't that much of, you risk missing out on an extremely beautiful, visceral, and moving film. Of course, you can watch the movie however you would like, but I think this one, you can really love this movie if you find the thread and the vibe, and if not, it might seem pretty weird and pretty flawed. Now, I have to admit that I don't know much about Alejandro Jodorowsky. I think that the way that the Holy Mountain is often talked about, it put me off a little bit. It made me suspect that he was playing for shock value, so I didn't watch it, but I underestimated him, it would seem, and I will be watching more Jodorowsky films in the near future. I hope I'm saying his name right. If you have any suggestions or anti-suggestions, let me know. I won't be diving into his biography too deeply in this video, besides to say two things. First, Jodorowsky seems to be perhaps principally a surrealist. And second, he has a little bit of a background in the circus, working as a mime and a clown, working alongside Marcel Marceau and Maurice Chevalier. Also, he's from Chile, but he's French as well. These two, but actually three things, are pretty telling when it comes to the vibe of this movie. The plot of Sangre is somewhat impossible to explain. I won't try. It is an important thing. It's an important piece of the movie, but the life force of the film seems to come from somewhere else. We could start by thinking about even, individual scenes or just individual frames, like just stills from the movie already capture something that's going on here. For instance, about 20 minutes into the film, a circus elephant dies. As the elephant is on its deathbed, blood pours from the end of its trunk. I don't think that's what really happens to elephants, but it is a visceral image, something unexpected, something kind of poetic. Surrealists are largely interested in the edges of reality, playing with the expectations conferred on us, the audience, by years and years of living in the real world. This movie, it tugs at the edges at every turn, almost every scene, maybe even every shot. And like I said, you can feel this just in individual still images, right? You'll have like a frame that has one really vivid image, a circus elephant, for instance, or maybe a tattooed lady, something with kind of a poetic energy. And then it's almost like there's a rule, there's an equation that Jodorowsky has to abide by. He has to add something else that's going to be in tension with this first thing. He has to unbalance things in some ways, or maybe he has to balance them depending on the perspective. And usually these relationships are not something that you can easily describe. I feel like I'm sort of raving like a madman here. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what creates the tension, but there is just a surreal energy to everything that comes across the screen. I guess you could say it's all kind of weird. For instance, after the elephant dies, there's a funeral procession for the elephant with a huge coffin. This almost sounds like a joke, and it almost is a joke. Maybe it is. All the circus people parade down the street wearing black versions of their typical costumes. Then they push this huge coffin off a cliff. Yeah, what a movie. I mentioned that Jodorowsky was a mime, and that probably influenced the content of the movie. I mentioned there is a circus elephant, and there's a lot of circus performance in the film itself, but it also influences the structure and the style. True fans of the channel will know that I grew up going to a lot of circus performances, a lot of juggling shows in particular. So I am very attuned to a certain type of vaudevillian dramatic logic. This is something you also see in like the Jacques Tati movies. I have a video about Playtime, one of the greatest movies ever made, a very vaudevillian film. Anyway, when you put together a vaudeville routine, you have to conjure a plot out of thin air. And more than that, you actually have to conjure sort of the very dramatic logic from nothing, from a blank stage. Sometimes you lean on established characters. Sometimes there is much more abstract logic. Got to touch this thing, that's going to make a funny noise, and then touch this thing, it'll make a different noise, or something like that. Maybe you just need to skew things enough so that the audience thinks that something will happen, that something is about to happen, and they wonder what it's going to be. This kind of logic, this sort of ad hoc dramatic logic created on the fly, just sort of conjured up through the artistic flourish. That's all over this movie. Of course, we have a bunch of shows within the movie. We have a bunch of routines. You know, if you've seen Mulholland Drive, you probably remember that Club Silencio scene, kind of a pivotal scene in that movie. Well, David Lynch owes Jodorowsky money, I swear. That odd performance has exactly the kind of tension that defined this movie. And like I said, we see plenty of actual performances in this movie that are very similar to what you find at Old Club at Silencio. Now here, these routines spill out into the movie itself, quite literally sometimes, with the knife thrower plying his trade for fun, or clowns running through the streets. Generally, this movie kind of feels like a dream, but it also has some stark moments. The clowns take to the streets, and the streets have a bunch of garbage in them. We see the streets of this movie set in Mexico, and the streets have hungry dogs running around. The nightlife and the cold light of morning with decoratory skeletons littering the pavement. The decorations from the party the night before. Of course, there's a couple of moments of gore here as well. Anyway, like I said, this movie really drifts in and out of reality, even though there isn't much that is explicitly unreal. There isn't real magic. We are still constantly slipping into Jodorowsky's strange, vaudevillian, dramatic universe. Hopefully, you're getting a sense of how this movie feels. Again, it's the sort of movie that makes you feel a little bit deranged talking about it, but bear with me. And let me give you one more example. Let me give you a really simple example. There's a minor scene that really stuck with me from this movie. There's a small moment where a girl runs away from home. She takes a blanket out onto the street. She just sets off into the night. She walks up to this huge truck, and it looks like she might be about to get into the cab, going up to the door, but instead, she climbs onto the top of the cab, and she sleeps there. She wraps herself in the blanket, and she sleeps on the top of this big Mack truck. Why? I don't know. But from reality, we take one big step that way into this special folkloric universe where it's as if everything could be a metaphor or part of a folk tale. Don't think everything is a metaphor, but it could be. Jodorowsky really brings a vision to this movie, and he makes something that is not much like anything else, that couldn't be translated into any other format, and that probably is saying something that you can't say any other way. And what more could you want from a movie than that? Okay, what's the movie actually about? A lot of things. I'm not going to go through the plot. Like I said, it's immense. You might be tempted to say that the movie doesn't have a plot, but in fact, it's very intricately constructed, very well put together with lots of callbacks and twists. It would take 5 hours to explain. Instead, we can talk about some themes. Probably the most prominent ideas in the movie are about motherhood and masculinity. Those two seem to be connected, perhaps. Is it the Hispanic Oedipal story? I'll leave that to you, but clearly the relationship between Phoenix, that's the main character, and his mother, that's the other main character, is at the center of the film. This is a relationship that is grounded in Phoenix's childhood, which we see part of at the beginning of the movie. The very beginning opens with Phoenix in an asylum, roosting on a tree inside of a white room as if he is a bird. You may have already noticed the bird theme. He's got a big bird tattoo on his chest. More generally, there's an animal theme. How did Phoenix end up in this asylum? Who knows, but there's a little bit of a dramatic hook for the film. Before we know it, we have hitched a ride on a hawk to go back in time to Phoenix's childhood. And I won't spoil what happens here, even though it's kind of still the beginning of the movie, but we get to know young Phoenix, a magician in a circus, and we meet his family, although at first it's not obvious that that's what they are. In fact, I'm not sure if the knife thrower he hangs out with is his father, his stepfather, or a father figure, or just some guy. We meet the knife thrower mid-tryst he is seemingly being unfaithful to Phoenix's mother. Actually, a couple weeks back, I did a video about my favorite scenes in movies, and I talked about the knife throwing scene in The Girl on the Bridge. Turns out they borrowed that idea, that concept, from this movie. That's still a great scene. Anyway, young Phoenix, this I will say, I think this is a more influential movie than you might realize. I think a lot of people potentially owe Jodorowsky money. Anyway, young Phoenix has an amorphous home life. You don't really realize that it's his father. I also didn't really realize that his mother was his mother at first. But he does seem relatively happy. At least he's living in kind of an adult way as part of this circus. He's beyond his years in some ways, performing all kinds of tricks in the shows. He's friends with a girl who can't speak. She's a mime of sorts, but is also being somewhat forcefully trained to walk a burning tightrope. Everything feels a bit like it could be a metaphor. One interesting thing about circuses is that they tend to be hereditary. Children learn the secrets of their parents, and they carry on the legacy potentially. And they don't go to school or participate in society. So what choice do they have? This could be a nice metaphor for the sort of conditioning that you find in families and societies for the establishment of certain values within, like a family. Anyway, after we get to know Phoenix, we basically see his entire world crumble. We see this kid be scooped out. It's kind of grim. It starts with the elephant dying, this symbolic moment in some ways, and then we move on to some much less symbolic trauma. And you'll have to watch the movie to see what happens here. But this kid, yeah, he basically has everything stripped away from him. And in some ways, the rest of the movie is going to be him trying to find his way back from this trauma. Now, Jodorowsky himself had a somewhat tumultuous upbringing. I'm not going to read too much into that, but it fits. It's worth mentioning. This pivotal mother character is very interesting. She starts out fairly sympathetic, but the moral arc of the film is about to go crazy. Your allegiances may change. She comes back into Phoenix's life years later in one of the most beautiful scenes you will see anywhere. She stands outside the asylum waiting for him. It's a simple image. It's like one shot. And look, the funny thing is that the plot here really doesn't even make any sense. The night before, Phoenix goes on an excursion organized by the asylum. They're supposed to go to a movie. That's not quite what ends up happening. And instead, Phoenix ends up seeing someone that he knows from his childhood, seeing someone who is in the circus. And you might think, okay, well, he's going to follow this person. He's going to find his way back, or they're going to see him, right? Plot is going to happen. But instead, the movie abruptly cuts to the next day. This little storyline is never exactly resolved. He's just back in his white room at the asylum. But then, cut to his mother waiting for him outside. There's no logical connection here, but we're riding some sort of emotional tide, as if seeing the person from the night before had opened a door inside Phoenix, had made him somehow ready for the next step on his journey. The cause and effect in this movie is very interesting, almost a little bit reversed in some ways. This movie works. It works in strange ways, let me tell you. Now, there's also something to be said about Phoenix and his father, the knife thrower, and another type of generational wound. This knife thrower, Orgo, is a brutal character. He perpetrates one of the most difficult scenes to watch in the movie. Well, maybe two of them, three of them. But does he also have a moment of kinship with Phoenix? Does he have some kind of connection there? Phoenix later finds himself throwing knives, carrying the legacy forward in some ways, sporting the same tattoo, for better or worse. You know, when I say all this stuff about mom and dad, it sounds a little too on the nose. I feel like in general, it's very hard to talk about this movie. You know, it's hard to put your finger on what it's like, and it's hard to talk about the themes. It feels a bit reductive, because in truth, this is a very messy movie that, like I said, eludes words mostly. So I'm doing my best, but it doesn't sound quite as good when I say it as when you see it for yourself. Anyway, those are probably the big ideas that most people would pull out of this movie. There are a lot of other themes and motifs, which we'll talk about, but let's take a quick break to look at the style and the mechanics of the film. And I've already touched on the cinematography, of course, which is incredibly good, although it's unorthodox at time and even a little bit jarring, and there's a few places that seem almost a little amateurish, perhaps. The music is another high point of the movie. Mostly, we hear a bunch of really cool songs. Jodorowsky gives Wong Kar-wai a run for his money with the soundtrack in this movie. Although there are also a couple of pieces that were probably scored for the film, which sound like the 1980s. It's worth noting that this movie is actually newer than you might expect in some ways. When I think of Jodorowsky and Argento, I think of the 1970s, and this, in a lot of ways, actually, it is kind of a 1970s movie, but it was made in 1989, almost in the 90s, right? Maybe that gave them a little leg up in some ways. The sound design is also conspicuously good in this movie. The acting is interesting. I think it mostly works with the movie, but there's a few times when Phoenix opens his mouth that weren't very convincing. He was played by one of Jodorowsky's sons, and mostly he does a good job looking moody and being mime-like, but it's not perfect. There are absolutely hiccups in this movie, perhaps flaws even. There are a few jarring jumps forward in time, well, and backwards too, where you might need a second to figure out what's going on. Wait, I thought, wasn't he? Huh? What? But you'll catch on. The pacing of the ending is also a little bit iffy. Maybe it takes one too many left turns. If you're into the movie, if you're really feeling it, you might not notice any of this stuff. But like I said, if you aren't feeling the movie, you really might not like it. It took me 15 or 20 minutes to get into the movie emotionally, to really feel it in here. I'm almost certainly going to watch it again because it's so rich in detail and in quirk, and because I suspect the beginning is also probably great, but, you got to know what you're getting into, which I didn't. Anyway, there is so much more that we could talk about. Let's do a quick fire motif round. First, there is the blood. Blood, it's in the title. It's in my veins, as far as I know. It's thicker than water, a nod to the connection between mother and son, perhaps. Maybe a proxy for the traumas in life. We see blood spilled many times, and it's kind of jarring. Now we've got birds and animals all over the movie as well. A lot of the ideas and the themes and the emotions that we're dealing with here are kind of animalistic, but there's also a spiritual and iconic feeling to these animals, I suppose. We could go way deeper here, but this is the lightning round. I shortchanged you on the animals, but let's keep going. There are some interesting tricks with scale in the movie. Scale. There's really big elephants, but there's also a dwarf. There's a child who acts like an adult and an adult who acts like a child. The temporal scale is funky as well, as I already alluded to. Maybe this is all something that helps contribute to this dreamlike feel. We see a lot of magic tricks in the movie, circus arts. We talked about this a little bit already, but it's interesting that Phoenix is the owner of these secrets. In theory, that's empowering to have this bag of tricks that adds up to being you, to an identity. But it also seems to saddle him with dependencies and leave him mostly without much to say and without much to show for himself. We haven't talked much about Phoenix's speechless romantic interest, a very different type of person than his mother. This movie relies on couple formation a little bit. I was kind of surprised by this. This is not a Hollywood movie at all, and yet it does posit romantic love and couple formation as the antidote to all this childhood trauma, or the destination that you are crawling to as you shed your skin. This reminds me a little bit of some of Leos Carax's movies, except his most recent one, basically all of them except for that. These are radical movies, but also romantic. And I have mixed feelings about this. You're eschewing so much about society, but you're still stuck on couple formation. Well, I don't know. Maybe there's something to it. Who knows? Speaking of Hollywood, by the way, the U.S. sneaks into this movie in a few places. Orgo, the knife thrower, has an American flag he carries around with him. When they go to the funeral parade, he has a black American flag. He has, starkly blonde hair. And the circus is called Gringo Circus. Why is that? Phoenix watches a bit of the film The Invisible Man at one point, Hollywood movie. Not a big thing, but what's going on here? I'm honestly not sure, but there's something going on with American influence. This movie is in English, by the way, even though it was an Italian and Mexican co-production. So perhaps Jodorowsky is taking a page from Godard's Contempt, or it could have something to do with his earlier life. Jodorowsky isn't your typical Chilean name, and I think his family immigrated there from the Ukraine. I think they didn't reveal their history to Jodorowsky for many, many years, so perhaps this has something to do with his relationship to the wider world. I'm not sure. We could go all day talking about this movie, which in itself is a huge endorsement of the film, in my opinion. There's so much here. I mean, really, like, this American thing, yeah, I really don't know what to make of that. There's so much here. I'm so glad to have found it and to have shared some of these things with you. If you have any thoughts about this movie, let me know. I'm probably going to watch it again. Maybe I'll make another video about it. Who knows? I really like Santa Sangre. What a blessing. Truly, sometimes I think, will I ever watch another good movie again? Have I already seen everything? Do I need to whack myself about the skull with a big hammer? And just to get the joy of rediscovering stuff? But no, there's so much great stuff out there. Hopefully, this isn't the last movie. We'll see. Anyway, hey, you may notice that right back there, there we go, there's something missing. There used to be a record on the wall. Jason Webley's The Cost of Living, if you have wondered. Where'd it go? Well, I'm in the middle of moving. I'm packing up my whole apartment right now, and this is the last video that you'll see from here. Kind of amazing. Cool that it's such a great video to end things off. I may or may not make a video next week as I go through the whole moving process. For now, I gotta go pack up a few things.